So good morning. I'm David Roxburgh, Department Chair and Prince Al Walid bin Talal Professor of Islamic Art History at the Department of History of Art and Architecture at Harvard University. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to the keynote session of Art Museums and the Legacies of the Dutch Slave Trade, Curating Histories, Envisioning Futures. This four-part program is presented by the Center for Netherlandish Art at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, the Harvard Art Museums, and Harvard University's Department of History of Art and Architecture. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that Harvard University, the Harvard Art Museums, and the Museum of Fine Arts Boston are situated on the traditional and ancestral territory of the Massachusetts people. We collectively recognize the long history of the land our institutions occupy today, and we strive to honor this relationship and to make Indigenous narratives more prominent in our teaching and programming. The ongoing responsibility of universities and other institutions to reshape the humanities in particular through teaching and research have never been more apparent, and it is an ambition that has shaped this four-part program, which seeks to center the experience of people of African origin and descent who were enslaved by the Dutch and other European powers in recognition of the relationship of past injustices to the present. Following the murder of George Floyd last year and increased awareness of racially motivated violence against Black, Indigenous, and people of color, it has never been clearer that universities have an urgent responsibility to promote anti-racism. I'm very pleased to acknowledge the 3 doctoral students in Harvard's Department of History of Art and Architecture and the Harvard Art Museum's postdoctoral fellow who initiated and organized this program: Sarah Mallory, Kayla Jackson, Rachel Burke, and Joanna Seldenstein. For supporting student research that informed this undertaking, we are very grateful to the Presidential Initiative on Harvard and the Legacy of Slavery, a university-wide effort housed at the Harvard Radcliffe Institute. It is now my great pleasure to hand things over to one of our truly remarkable doctoral students and conference organizers, Rachel Burke.
Thank you, David, for your introduction and for your support. On behalf of my co-organizers, I also want to offer special thanks to Susan Anderson, Mariah Speck, and especially Erica Lawton for their essential contributions. I also want to thank everyone who is tuning into this session, Curating Histories, Envisioning Futures, the keynote event of a conference that has been tracing the legacies of the Dutch slave trade and its ramifications on art and museums. In the 16th century, the Dutch became major players in the Atlantic sugar trade. For 2 decades in the 17th century, the Netherlands also maintained a colonial settlement in Brazil before war with Spain ultimately redirected Dutch trading ambitions to the Caribbean. Merchants and oligarchs orchestrated the traffic of hundreds of thousands of people from Africa to these islands, where they were sold and enslaved, often in the name of sugarcane. By the 1630s, the Dutch were enjoying the rewards of their success at sea, a history that lives on, perhaps paradoxically, in the landscape, in the tulip. An exotic flower, the tulip was a coveted luxury item, the perfect garland for a culture rich in capital and cosmopolitanism. Over 350 years after the bulb made its debut in Amsterdam, my grandparents and their children emigrated from Holland to the United States, where my grandfather worked as a gardener for the Dutch embassy in DC, coaxing this very symbol of the Netherlands to bloom over American soil. Across our yards too, tulips flowered, our colorful flags of a home and heritage OPA planted for us. However, we, and I mean white people, we must keep in mind that paradigms of beauty and paradigms of place are rarely strangers to paradigms of power. This story of the tulip is also a story of deracination. It is a species not native to the Netherlands and speaks to the ways botany conspired in violent colonial regimes of displacement and dispossession. Today, our speakers ask from the wake of Dutch economic and cultural identity formation. What happens when the surface of the earth is rearranged? Who is allowed to plant roots? Where do memories of home go when its soil has been stolen? What are the legacies recorded and collected when the relationship between space and self is complicated? Before we begin to explore these questions, some logistics about today's program. Your microphones and videos will remain off, but we do very much welcome your participation via the Q&A box, which you should be able to access at the bottom of your screen. We'll take questions throughout the conversation portion of our event. You can answer your questions into the Q&A box at any time. If your question is for a specific speaker, please indicate that. And since we have such a large audience, it is possible we won't be able to address every question, although we will do our best to do so. And we will conclude the session around 12 o'clock Eastern time, though we hope you'll also tune in at 1 o'clock for a final session, a roundtable discussion with specialists of Dutch and American art history. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce our three distinguished speakers who will be in conversation today. Rosana Paulino is a Sao Paulo-based artist whose work focuses on the position of Black women in Brazilian society. Her prints, drawings, sculptures, installations, and assemblages explore and express the physical and emotional violence suffered because of racism and the many legacies of slavery. Her work is represented in the collections of the Museu de Arte Moderna in Sao Paulo, the University of New Mexico Art Museum, and the Museu Afro-Brazil, and she has participated in numerous exhibitions in Brazil, as well as France, Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, Belgium, South Africa, and the United States. Paulino was awarded a Ford Foundation International Fellowship in 2006 and a Rockefeller Foundation Bellagio Center Residency Fellowship in 2014. She holds a doctorate from the University of Sao Paulo. Jamaica Kincaid is one of the most highly acclaimed writers of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Her works include Annie John Lucy, the autobiography of my mother, and Mr. Potter, as well as her classic history of Antigua, A Small Place, and the memoir, My Brother. Her first book, The Collection of Stories at the Bottom of the River, won the Morton Dowen Zabel Award from the American Academy and Institute of Arts and was nominated for the P.E.N. Faulkner Award for Fiction. Kincaid was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Letters in 2004. She has received a Guggenheim Award, the Lannan Literary Award for Fiction, the Prix Féminin Étranger, Annisfield Wolf Book Award, the Clifton Fadiman Medal, and the Dan David Prize for Literature. She is currently Professor of African and African American Studies in residence at Harvard. Moderating our conversation is Cheryl Finley, the director of the Atlanta University Center of Art History and Curatorial Studies Collective, and distinguished visiting professor of art history at Spelman College. She leads an innovative undergraduate program at the world's largest historically Black colleges and universities consortium in preparing the next generation of African-American museum and visual arts professionals. Dr. Finley is a curator, contemporary art critic, and award-winning author noted for Committed to Memory, the art of the slave ship icon, the first in-depth study of the most famous image associated with the memory of slavery and the art, architecture, poetry, and film it has inspired since its creation in Britain in 1788. On leave from Cornell University, where she is Associate Professor of Art History, Dr. Finley's current book project aims to diversify the global art economy, focusing on the relationship among artists, museums, biennials, and migration. All right, I think once we get Rosana's presentation up, we will take it away.
Okay, wow. Thank you so much for this invitation. It's really an enormous pleasure to be here today and discuss about my work and about slavery trade. And it's really an honor to be here. And I was asked to talk about memory, legacy, concepts of memory, and museums in my production. I will not talk exactly about the Dutch slavery trade, but how slavery trade, and in Brazil it was Portuguese people that made it, how it appeared in my work. And I believe that we have some threads that link memories from Black people that suffered with the slavery, not only in Brazil, but other countries as well, in the USA and the Caribbean. So I will try to talk a little about my work, and I will share now my screen because I am a visual artist. So I usually talk using images. I will share it, and I will start to my presentation now. Just hold on, please. It's here. Yes, it's here. Okay. As I was asked to talk about memories, my work, when I am talking about Black memories, it started with my family, trying to understand how the Black people deals with their memories, with their legacy in the country. So I started with my personal memories, trying to understand the group, the Black people. See, here we see this wall of memory. That is an enormous panel that I will show a detail now. And I was thinking about the Black families in the country and how it was destroyed. The links between Black people in the country was destroyed by the slavery trade, of course, because people arrived in the country, sometimes they were charity and they sold it for one place and the others for another. I mean, the families were destroyed. So I started to look at my family, trying to understand how Brazil was formed and how the place the Black females occupy in the society. So this is first work, that the wall of memory, trying to build again, to reconstruct the idea of family for these Black people. Here another that's called Arachnids, that means spider in English, where I was trying to make this thread to think about this, how it linked Black females, how work linked these families again. So I just made an enormous thread and put in this thread some images from my family. I started here a detail, one cocoon with the image of my mother, for example, and I was thinking, for example, all these Black females that I saw when I was a child, they seated and sewing and embroidery, and it was a way, they tell histories when they were working, and it was a way to maintain some links between them. So I was interested in this kind of links, and I started, as I told you, with images from my family. But of course, that's not possible to discuss a country using only images from your family. So I tried to enlarge my research about the females, and I started to look for images that were made in the slavery time, like this one of a net worth, wet nurse, and some of the maids and the images that portrayed the Black females. I started with this, and I started to make some artworks like this one, for example, that I was interested that these females, it was like to ask these females to come and to tell their histories, because they must be listened. These females that must be listened in order to understand what Brazil is and why this country is like it is. And this was made in a senzala. Senzala was a place where enslaved people lived. So this is an installation that was made in a senzala. I'll detail more. Whereas I had this hand is coming from the wall. It was like to call these women, say, okay, come here, come to say your history. You want to listen you want to listen your histories. And we have this hand is coming from the wall, and with this tissue linking this, and it was for me like a symbol for the milk, trying to show the the link between these women and their tasks as wet nurse. But I was still working and researching about photos from Black females, and I found this image that just changed the direction of my career, because it showed me, when I saw this image, I was so impacted, I was so touched by this image about this female in this situation, Black and side and front. And I thought, why this photo? What is this? And it showed me one thing that is very important to understand Brazil. That is this racism, but this kind of scientific racism, the portraits that were made in the country. And it was a thing that people really did not talk about. And I thought, why people don't discuss this kind of thing in Brazil? Why people don't discuss about science and how science and imagery and photography built the country? That is very important to understand the situation of Black people in Brazil nowadays. So I started to use this kind of photos in my work. Like for here, for example, this enormous installation that's called the Settlement, and that show the same image, this female in front and side and back. Here I detail more. I was interested not in numbers, but I was interested in the tragedy of the slavery trade, because this woman in Africa had a family, had a culture, had a language, and she just was kidnapped and brought to the country, brought to Brazil. And we have a trauma here. We have a trauma. How to show this? I am not interested in numbers. I know that 5 million Black people arrived in the country, but I was interested in a special history, her history, which history this woman had before being kidnapped, and how she rebuild herself, because she had no choice. Or she rebuild herself, or she would die. But of course, we have a trauma here. We have a trauma that's not possible to rebuild yourself without a trauma. So I start to make this sewing, for example. And when we look at this, we see that it did not fix perfectly. This is the way for me to show the trauma of slavery, not only for her, but for the population, for the Black population in the country. And I hear another showing her in back. And I like this image a lot because it shows in the roots that these people not only arrived in the country, but they rooted in the country, they built the country. That's very important for me, this idea of roots, and then this idea of these red veins as well, that not only roots, but show that the country was built on the blood, inside the blood of Black people. And that the images of science show another way, as I told you, to think about my work. And I did this book called The Natural History, with comma, trying to think how science, trying to investigate better how science was involved in this idea of slavery and justified this idea of slavery. So I did this natural history. It's an artist book that show, I show you some images for this. And this the book started with these three phrases: o progresso das nações, a salvação das almas, o amor pela ciência. That means the progress of the nations, the salvation of the souls, and the love for the science. All the things that were used to justify the slavery. And here, for example, we can see images of, in the book, flora, the fauna, and the people. And these, of course, the names are in Portuguese, and agentes means the people. I was interested about this history, how science is linked with the idea of domination and of exploitation as well. And this, I was asking about science and about classification of Black people, and asking if, in Portuguese, we can read here, a ciência é a luz da verdade. It means something like science is the light of the truth. I was discussing about the science and the role played by the science in this history in Brazil. And I started to, after I finished the book, I started to asking the same questions, but using different media, like this, for example, the salvation of the souls. And we see here this image, but we see Portuguese style as well, just to mark that Portuguese people were the people that enslaved, that bring the slavery for the country. And I was interested in nature as well. I started to have my interest linked to the nature when I saw for the first time that image, but I was not interested only in human body, but in the nature at all. How people and the nature was viewing as an enormous warehouse to be exploited in Brazil. How some bodies, like the Black bodies that the indigenous body were seen like together with the nature, as an enormous place, an enormous, as I told you, warehouse to be exploited. So this idea of tropical paradise that was built about Brazil, but a tropical paradise for whom? And here, the tropical paradise. And bring back to the idea of legacy and memories. I am saying quite quickly because it's almost 30 years of career, and it's difficult to summarize 30 years of career in 15 minutes, 20 minutes. But I brought these images. I chose some images that could tell a little about this. So my work all the time deals with this idea of a thread that links people, a thread that links nature, a thread that links memory, and a thread that links scientific knowledge as it was used to be considered, putting together things to understand the place that we occupy in the Brazilian society nowadays. So this is one work that I made in 2019 that is called the Grand Mass. In this video, you can find, if someone wants to see this video, just go to the Google and write my name, Rosana Paulino, plus, like it's here, Das Avós, and you can find the video to see. And in this video, I was thinking about this transference of memories. I have some images of maids and wet nurses, these women that existed, of course, and I'm calling them again to say their histories. But I was thinking about like this transmission, because Charlene, that is the person that is that is making this action, she does exist because these Black females existed before. But these Black females are bringing back to life because Charlene existed. So Charlene is sewing their images on her own body in order to bring them back to the life. So it's a video, a 10 minutes video that you can find, as I told you, just go to Google and write my name and the name of the video. And I bring back this idea of nature that goes and go back and it goes and go back, showing this line linking the past and the present in the country. And I am just finishing now, and I was interested as well in the psyche of Black females, because when we talk about Black females and when we talk about psychological aspects of Black females in the country, we use all that mythology from Europe, for example. But is that possible to use mythology from another continent to deal with psychological aspects of a Black female? So I started to make some drawings thinking about this task, and I'm trying to think about a psychological state for Black females in the country. And so I made some images like this, for example, laid off plants, linking this with nature, because again, nature is entering in the talking. The way that Black descendants see the nature, the way indigenous people see the nature and the deals with the nature is quite different from the way that people that came from Europe see the nature. We don't see the nature as something to be exploited. Maybe we see the nature like something that we are inside it. We are not here over the nature. We are here relating to the nature. So I start to think about some archetypes for Black females, and I made works like this jatoba. That's an enormous tree that we have in the country. Or like this, for example, she buffalo, that is directly linked with the idea of Oya Yansan, that is a deity that came from Africa to Brazil, and it is very common to find a person that has females that has this link with this idea of she buffalo. That's a female that's free, that has a great force, and I myself, a young son, for example, has this kind of an archetype So I started to think about this, how to deal with these ideas of mythologies and archetypes for Brazilian Black females. So I am just finished now because my time's okay. I hope you can understand my speech. If you want to see more about my work, you can just go here and you'll find more. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your remarks, Rosana. I would like to invite Jamaica Kincaid to now share hers.
I would be happy to yield any of my time to, oh gosh, that was amazing. I could go on listening to it. I'd be happy to yield some of my time, but so many subjects, so many things you touched on as you talked about, especially plants, is an interest of mine, all coming from the European encounter with this world. And the interesting thing, well, there are many interesting things, but one of the interesting things for me is when the interest in what the new world, and I use all these things in quotes, could yield, because the first venture into it is they thought they would find lots of gold and minerals, the mineral kingdom. And I think that must have been especially true for the Spanish, because I think so much of the, speaking of memory, I think so much of the Spanish memory of their conquest by the Romans was that Spain produced a lot of mining of minerals for the Romans. And so I've always thought that, is it possible that they were influenced, speaking of memory, by that when they went out into the New World, everybody they met, they say, where's the gold, where's the gold, where's the minerals, the diamonds, and so on. And so then with the introduction of this slave trade, or the introduction of the African, then they turned to the vegetable kingdom. And I just want to, in the introduction, I think someone said that botany conspired, and I want to remove the botany and everything from the vegetable kingdom from this evil enterprise that Europeans engaged in, so that, you know, the growing of cotton is so tainted, or sugarcane is so tainted, so many things that Europeans got their hand on in this paradise. I mean, the entrance of Europeans into this part of the world is almost a repetition of the Garden of Eden. And in fact, when they encounter the New World, they say it's paradise, and immediately violate the paradise, immediately eat the fruit, and turn paradise into a hell. So I want to just say, botany did not conspire. Botany remains free of the evil that was done. Cotton is a beautiful plant, and in fact, I grow it in my garden as an ornamental to honor it. But then, now my interest in the Dutch, or in Europe, I feel I understand enough, or if not understand enough, certainly what I lack. Professor Paulino tells me even more, and really expands my thinking. But I've become, or I guess I've always become fascinated by the European not examining what this action into this foray into this world and what they made of the people and the places did to them. It seemed to unleashed in these ordinary plodding along people an unprecedented evil, or certainly not an evil that I've seen recorded in any history of the world. You know, that within 50 years of Christopher Columbus's encounter with the Arawaks in the Greater Antilles, they were dead, and it was or vanished, disappeared genocidally, and that it was out of sympathy for their suffering that Bartolome das Casas suggested the Africans, and so would be good for slavery. So out of a sympathy for one group of people comes this imposition of evil on another group of people, and on a scale again that's unimaginable or until then, I think, and a consciousness imposed on the slave and the master, or maybe impose is the wrong word, but certainly inspiring, a consciousness inspiring in both people a way of looking at humanity that seems to have not happened before. We know the suffering, we who are descendants of the slaves know the suffering, and can articulate it very well, even if it's only for ourselves so far. But I've been always interested in how Europeans never looked at the way their actions affected them. It destroyed this idea of the constructive Western civilization as some almost biblical holy myth is laughable, really, and makes you disrespect them. Any thought you have of, oh, these might be intelligent people, the minute they come up with this thing of Western civilization and how grand it is just laughable. But anyway, I've just been always interested in how it worked, how the transformation from being ordinary people plodding along, eating dull bread and living not very long, suddenly they become masters of the world. For instance, and talking about the Dutch and slavery, well, when the Dutch couldn't have an empire the way the British or the French did, they resorted to trade, and it's interesting to see how they got rich and what they did with it. We mentioned I'm looking at the time, we mentioned the tulip, but the tulip, that is the national symbol, I think it's a national emblem of the Dutch, is not native to that part of the world, Holland, the Low Countries. I mean, oh God, there's so much to begin with. The Low Countries. If you read Shakespeare, of a writing of a certain period, there's always this contest for invading the Low Countries. It's the Dutch. Suddenly, the Dutch no longer the victims of invasion. They become, instead of learning that to be the victims of invasion is to suffer, they then launch out into the world and cause enormous suffering, including, just taking people's plants, land, but plants in particular interest me with them, because the largest export from Holland are flowers. Almost, all right, I'll not say almost, I'll say everything plant they export is not native to Holland. I wonder what's native to Holland. And then I began to notice that there's a great garden designer Piet Odolph is his name, I think. Piet, I might be mispronouncing it. And I say he's great because he's very famous. And even I sometimes will think, oh, that's interesting. But his great contribution to contemporary gardening, this Dutchman, is the grass. The grass. Yes, grass, the simple grass, ornamental grasses, it's called. And so I think also grass must be the thing that's native to Holland. But the history of the Dutch and other people's things, including other people, is simply fascinating to watch, you know, the tulip, but especially the tulip bulbs of every kind. There isn't a single bulb you put in your garden that they don't produce. The tulip, the history of the tulip is well known, you know, that somebody saw it in Turkey, smuggled it out. Some ambassadors smuggled it out in a bag. The Dutch then got their hands on it. But what's interesting to me is why they in particular became obsessed with this flower so that it destroyed their economy. There's a wonderful painting by Jerome, the French painter, of soldiers destroying tulip fields because tulips were forbidden. It was so dangerous to the economy. And so there's that. And then there's all these paintings I look at before the Dutch got rich off of Africans and the things Africans could produce for them, and how innocent and you know, admirable they were. And then suddenly you have Rembrandt, and you have all this stuff of people piling on the riches that they'd gotten from the rest of the world. And in particular, I don't know, I'm not an art historian, but I don't know that anyone painted the still life of flowers as obsessively as the Dutch. And almost all the flowers from somewhere, well, all the flowers are from somewhere else, certainly from Europe. A couple of interesting things about the plant world and the Dutch that are interesting to me is that a director of the East India Company named George Clifford, who was a friend of Carolus Linnaeus, and Carolus Linnaeus, on his way to England, stopped off and visited his friend, who was a hypochondriac. And Linnaeus, of course, being a doctor, they spent some time, 2 years together. And Linnaeus went through a greenhouse, you would call it, of plants that George Clifford owned in Holland. There were plants from, the reason they were housed is they were tender, so they were from the tropical part of the world. And Linnaeus went through them and named them, categorized and named them. And that becomes a book he published called Hortus Cliffortianus. And so the binomial system is in fact established with that. And the binomial system and categorization then becomes applied to us as races. It formalizes certain things, certain dangerous ideas that we still live with. And then one other last thing, and before I go on madly in this way, is that another East India official was in Japan, and were not allowed in Japan. So he was on his ship. His name was von Siebold. And he was involved in trade with the Japanese, and he introduced a number of plants from Japan, all of which bear his name. So if you come across a plant and it has von Siebold attached to it, know that its origin is Japanese. Even the Japanese have to call it Sieboldana. Hosta Sieboldana, Viburnum Sieboldana. Hostas are native to different places, but the Sieboldana hosta is particular to Japan, as is the Sieboldana viburnum. Anything Sieboldana, primroses, that's how you know it's Japanese. So all of these things, my collection of, I should apologize for not having any, I only should apologize because I would love to have shown you pictures of, but I don't know how to use a PowerPoint, and my children are asleep or my students are away. So I apologize for that. But all of that, this is, again, part of my interest in the European venture into the world, how it disrupted their society. And you can find it, you know, in novels, Jane Austen, though she's a peculiar obsession with weak-minded people. George Eliot in France, Balzac, how it disrupted the morals of Europeans, that they never consider. They're always looking at us and making statements, whether we are inferior intelligently. And let me just say that no being of any kind survives because it's not intelligent. Everything that survives, that has, that everything that's alive right now has intelligence. And the idea that it can be judged and categorized and make arrangements about is such a, it's not a crime, it's such a sin, whatever, it's such against, it strikes at the heart of what it is to be. The idea of judging and categorizing and looking at and criticizing is a sin, whatever you believe in, whether you're an atheist or it's a sin. But then, anyway, I end with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamaica, for your expansive and insightful remarks. I now welcome to the digital stage Cheryl, who will moderate a conversation.
Thanks so much, Rachel, and thank you, Rosana and Jamaica, for your really, really insightful remarks. I'd like to begin with some questions from our viewing audience that will address Rosana's presentation and her work, and then we're going to transition to bring the conversation of all of us together. I think that the remarks that you just concluded, Jamaica, especially around thinking about, you know, the role of nature and this politics of naming is something that I definitely want to get back to. When you talked about the hosta sibelius, that I know about that hosta. I planted those hostas. I have those hostas in my garden. So these are the kinds of things that we, you know, not just we or maybe one takes for granted, that are part of this larger conversation, when often the focus is upon how the history and the legacy of the Dutch slave trade has affected people, right? But we have to, as Rosana's work points out, we have to see also how the history and legacy of the Dutch slave trades and the slave trade and slavery has affected land. And also, you know, the point of the flora and the fauna that you shared in your work as well. So I want to begin with just a couple of questions that are about process and understanding your work, Rosana. This is from Marcia Stein Adams. And she says, I noticed the use of thread in Rosana Paulino's work and wondering if it serves as a way of stitching back together, of repairing connection to the history and ancestry. And I'd like to loop that to another question that also asks about your use of threads. And if you could talk about the kinds of threads that you use in your work that is labeled as scientific art. And this is from another audience member. Rosana, your audio.
Sorry for that. I do this all the time. Oh God. Okay. Thank you for the question. The idea to use the threads, for example, I have a concept that is, I mean, both concepts is to use the thread in a way to link past, to link ideas, to link people and lives from different times and places. This is one way that I use the thread. But for me, I developed a concept that is about suture. Like suture, how it is used in medicine, in surgery, because this process of slavery was so violent that people that to rebuild themselves, to make themselves in order to survive. So it's so violent that I like to use this idea of to put these tissues together to suture these parts. This was so violent in Brazil because here we did not consider the difference between the cultures and the people. We just tried to put them using force. So it is like a suture, it's so violent. And I was looking for a way to transmit the idea of trauma. As I told you, I was interested not only in the numbers, because we know the enormous quantity of Black that arrived in the country, but I was not interested in this. I was interested in trauma. So how represents the trauma? That is so difficult. So I was looking for a way to show the trauma. And I remember about the idea of suture, to put things together using force. But trauma is something that you can put these different parts together, but it is still, trauma still remains in the society. Right. So I thought that the best way was suture and try to develop this idea.
And hence even the color red that we see in some of the threads that you use. I think, another way to maybe extend our answers and thought around this question, and maybe also bring you into the conversation, Jamaica, and thinking about trauma and thinking about transgenerational trauma, if we're going to talk about 500 years and counting of this, of this trauma, and the use of suture to try to kind of bring together history and memory. A question for both of you might be, how are you working with images and written language to, using your word, Rosana, to suture memory and history? How do you feel your respective creative practices are addressing the differences between history and memory?
Rosana.
Again, okay, thank you. In my case, for example, the difference entre memory and history for me is because memory is something so personal. I can see the word in a way, and I can have some information that came from my family and my background and my group, and that's memory for me, because history has a side. In Brazil, history has the side of the people that conquered, the people that enslaved the others. So this is the memory, and I have to define the memory. But when I try to deal with my memories, it's something that has, for me, affection. So I can use, for example, the idea of suture, but I can use as well the idea to link people together. This is memory, because I am using one thing that I learned with my mother. I saw my mother sewing and embroidering a lot of times. So I bring something that's mine, and that has affection for me, to define the history. I mean, to define that history that people told me about my group. So for me, memory is so powerful, because I can bring things that I have inside me, inside my group, to define the official history that were told to us. I make this kind of difference between memory and history.
And so maybe we could think about the first images that you showed from Wall of Memory, as kind of a visual answer to go with what you're saying. And one of the things that I see in your use of these images of people, people who are familiar to you, that there was also what I found really interesting, a pattern within the wall of memory, that you stitched together these portraits, but also that there's a repetition of certain figures within that wall and that tapestry that you share.
Yes, that's true. And it's a way, when I put them, for example, that small, the name in Portuguese is patois. I will say cushion when I put them inside that cushion, it's like to put them under my protection.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's like to put them and to guard them, to put them under protection, to be in a protect way. This is memory for me, because it has a lot, a lot of love, a lot of intimacy, a lot of respect. Mm-hmm. So it's like to protect them. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I have this like an enormous memory game. As you told you, sometimes I have the same photo can be together. So it's like to put them in an enormous memory game. And that work is enormous. It's 1,500 pieces. It's enormous. So you can ignore one that people, in the crowd, but you can't ignore 1,500 pairs of eyes on you.
Right.
Mm-hmm. So this is history, because I am bringing them, to defy. I mean, all the time I am trying to make a game between memory and between history.
Thank you, Rosana.
Oh,
Jamaica.
We forget that Memory herself, the goddess Memory, had 9 daughters, and the 9 daughters, when you examine them, are the cornerstone on which civilizations are based on. One of them is history. If you look at what they represent, and so it seems particularly apt and particularly wonderful that we are engaged in memory, in fact, and we're often put down for it, because it's a memory. When we talk about memory, it's regarded as lesser than history, but in fact, history is a daughter of memory. I find that one of the wonderful things about the people we are concerned with and attached to is that fragile as memory is in itself, especially when it's situated in one individual, but we have made it not situated in one individual. We've made it situated in all of us, interconnected to all of us. We even have the memory of the perpetrators stored so that we can remind them of what they did. It's not history, it's something that actually happened. So I think the notion of memory is very important and a substantial foundation for the sort of thing that we do. I hope I can include myself in this. So yeah, memory, we have to in a way resurrect or rethink the position of memory in what we do, not recording, but the memory of it, because recording leaves out the feeling of what happened. And I think what you said about the suturing, so beautiful, so wonderfully put, and which also an admission that once something has been broken, it can never be put back together again, but what it was should be remembered, what it had been before it was broken. And your images of things that were broken and then stitched back but not quite is just extremely important and wonderful. And so thank you.
Yes, thank you. I would agree. I mean, it's just that disconnect that we saw in the image where you purposely, did not make things align as they might should for the eye.
They can never be again.
Yeah,
they can never be.
So I want to go back to a question that's about your work, Rosana. This is from Nancy Scott. She asks about your image, Tropical Paradise. She said she's curious to know about the flowers and tiles to the left of the female body. The latter looks like Delft tiles, and I would say azulejos. These images of the woman's body, poignant in regard to the horrific other images we've seen from the 18th and 19th century slave trade, et cetera. So she wanted to know about your use of these tiles, and maybe it's a question about how we've talked about the flora and the fauna, but also how certain artistic practices are also traveling from continent to continent.
Yes, the styles, for example, they really traveled from China, for example, to Portugal. Remember that Portugal arrived in the Asia early, and they traveled from Asia, from China to the other countries, they arrived to Dutch culture as well. So we have here one thing that is information and art is traveling around the world. The tiles that I use are from Portugal. I like this idea of tiles because Brazil was really marked by this technique, by tiles. Nowadays, we have in the houses in Brazil, it's very strong. We still have use a lot of ceramics and tiles, and it is a mark. But at the same time, I am thinking about this global market that is included slavery, but included the ways of thinking, it included the arts, and it will remind us in Brazil about this colonization. So I like to use you can identify like Dutch tiles, but they are really Portuguese. And sometimes images of slavery as well traveled around the world. I have some works, for example, that use images of blacks that were used in USA, that were used in Cuba, and that were used in Brazil. So I am thinking about all this knowledge traveling around the world. And then about botanics as well. Jamaica told us, brought us the idea of the flowers and the plants, and all this kind of commerce and the people and the flora, and even about the fauna, because the animals as well were in this kind of commerce. We had a first kind of globalization at that moment, all this traveling. So I like to use this and think about the ideas that were created about the new world, and the new world has an Eden, the Garden of the Eden. The Garden of the Eden, this tropical paradise, about all this idea that was created at that moment.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rosana. This is a question for both of you from Katie Boyle, who says, thank you so much, Rosana Paulino and Jamaica Kincaid. I noticed that the violent daguerreotype, which Dr. Paulino used to create the powerful images of settlement, was commissioned by Louis Agassiz, a white supremacist, scientist, and professor at Harvard. This, along with Professor Kincaid's discussion of Linnaeus and racialized categorization, makes me wonder about how we grapple with chattel slavery's transnational academic dimensions and afterlives in the present. Thank you again. So it's not a question really, but I think it's maybe an extension of us to, and an invitation to maybe think about what you were just concluding with, how, you know, it's not just people who travel or soil that travels or plant life that travels, but also that, you know, we as scholars, as writers, as artists, finding these objects within the archive or even living in and amongst them, how do we deal with these in the present within our own work?
Go ahead, Rosana. You answer. You go first, Rosana.
Java, I would like to listen to you before.
Oh.
Could you please?
Don't be shy.
Well, how do I deal with this in my work? I don't know that that's quite how the word deal with. I observe all these things, and I really do understand that what's done can't be undone, but it must be recognized if we are to not do that again. Now, my shallow understanding of human nature or humanity or whatever you want to call it is that our experience with suffering never prevents us from inflicting suffering on others when we can. So I, look at these things and I think, well, this is very interesting, and I don't exactly know what to do with it other than to record it and to admit it to paper or to transmit it somehow. I don't, I think one thing I try to do with it is to transmit the truth of it, which I think Europeans have a great deal of difficulty living in. You know, it's often so laughable to hear them talk about immigrants coming to Europe to change Europe, and you think, oh my God, do you realize how many places you've gone and changed? Whatever it is people used to do, they no longer do because you forbade it. You know, one of the things the Spanish did when they got to South America was forbid growing of amaranth, which is a staple of, and asked them to grow wheat and barley. And who knows what that did to people's, well, we know what it did to people's lives, but so when I encounter these things, I can only record them and present them because so far they are not part of common knowledge. It's not part of common, well, it is part of common knowledge, but not common admission that Europeans, as they entered the world of other people, forcibly destroyed many things. And so I feel, well, apart from trauma and so on, that the facts of it is that within 50 years, people, a whole group of people had disappeared from the face of the earth. Just in that 50 years, the first act of Christopher Columbus's knowledge of his victory was early on in his journal. As the first encounter with these people, he handed his sword to a person he just met, and the person took it by the blade, and it's over. He knows it's over, because if you don't know, you can take you should take a sword by the handle then you don't know the dominance of the sword. And so I like to think of that's one of those key moments when something happens, and that it is not isolated, that it repeats itself in the encounters we make with each other. We know the moment you have lost, I've won. And what do you do when you know that? Do you say we've both lost or we've both won, or what kind of negotiations you make with that? Now that sounds very personal and unworkable because we're talking about global power. You know, Spain was in a weak position at that time and was making all these kinds of attachments or arrangements with other powers. I mean, and these are things we need to know so that, and as I was discussing earlier when we had this early meeting, that the King and Queen of Spain made this arrangement with the Tudor court to marry their daughter, Catherine of Aragon, to Arthur. Arthur died. Catherine marries Henry VIII, produces a daughter. He doesn't want daughters, so he divorces her, which causes the rise of the Anglican Church. Then he beheads the next wife, who's the mother of Elizabeth I. Henry dies without a male heir. There's his daughter Mary, who's the daughter of Catherine of Aragon. She produces a rain of blood on England. Then you have Elizabeth, who knights a man who has captured a slave ship and sold the contents, and he's knighted by Elizabeth for introducing a new form of trade to England.
And that's Sir John Hawkins.
That's right. And so for me, these are, when you memory again, I think, how astonishing. Is this a tale I am telling myself? Is this one of those Spanish no, this is so fantastic. These deeds of horror leading, and then to see that from Columbus to the knighting of Hood, I arrive in this narrative. The slave trade becomes a new source of commerce for England.
Mhm.
So I'd like to, oh, I'm sorry, Jamaica.
No, go ahead. I think we're running over time, but
we are. So we're really kind of out of time, but I have one last question that I'd like to ask, because, you know, we are also supposed to be talking about museums, right?
Okay.
And,
we are.
so we could probably continue speaking for another, 30 minutes or more. I'm going to try to sew
we
up.
are talking about museums. This is our museum. This
Yes,
is our museum. What I'm telling you is
yes, exactly.
I live in a museum.
A living museum. So I'm going to try to put two questions into one to get to this other more general question. And this is a question, I think it's actually for both of you, although I think one might have thought it might just have been for you, Jamaica. And to get back to the histories and legacies of the Dutch slave trade, this is a question about how we can think about the work of Rembrandt, just as an example, as part of the Dutch legacy of the slave trade, of wealth and of plants. And there was, of course, the conversation about, these still lives, et cetera. But looking at the work of Rembrandt, how might we think about that work as part of the legacy of the Dutch slave trade? And then to try to weave this together with thinking about the role of museums today, what would you like to see museums doing or not doing with regard to narrating histories of slavery and histories of racism? There's a lot of talk about decolonizing the museum and decolonial practices within museum practice, within curatorial practice. So if you could address that, please.
I will say, I wonder if museums will not follow the example, but draw inspiration from, for instance, the way botanical gardens are becoming to reconstitute themselves, where they started out as basically agents of agriculture, you know, cultivating things for certainly at Kew to send to various parts of the empire, and as trophies. They then became, you know, gardens telling of education, telling you, like the Stribing, for instance, in San Francisco, telling you about plants from Madagascar, was it South Africa? You know, but now they see themselves as places of preservation, that there are things lost in the wild, various indigenous plants that are disappearing, and so they've become areas of preservation, which isn't to say that museums should do that, but it certainly offers an example of reinterpreting your existence. What is a museum for? To only to show the work of, again, I'm thinking of going to Holland, and you know, there's a museum for everybody, and is that what it is for? Only a painting, only a this, only a that? Can museums, what is it for? What is it? Can it reinterpret itself? Not even reinterpret. Can it extend itself? Can it grow into something other than walls of cement, and you enter and
well, your answer, Jamaica, your answer actually, you know, reminds me of maybe the relationship between museums and their communities, right? Outside of those walls of concrete that you're having us imagine. And maybe one of the answers could be the ways that museums might be thinking more proactively and more into the future about how they actually engage with the communities that surround them. Not only in terms of the kinds of exhibitions that are on display, but perhaps bringing those exhibitions outside of the walls of the museums into the courtyards and into the streets within the civic spaces in the towns and cities and boroughs in which they're located, even involving those community histories and experiences of people and artists in and around them. Rosana, would you like to comment on the question of what would you like to see museums doing or not doing with regard to narrating histories of slavery and racism, or even just, you know, what they should be doing or not doing today?
Okay, I think that the first thing is to think that to consider the group that formed the museum. I think that we have had more Black people, more Native people working there, more females working there. We have to change the narrative that the artists are doing this. I myself, for example, people asked me about the use of that image from Legacies. I am using the image and changing the meaning of the image. I am bringing a new narrative, new ideas about that image. I think that museums could do to rethink about their patrimony, to rethink about the pieces that they have inside and try to put them in a different context in order to give the people the opportunity to think about that, about the way that they are put, the way that they are showing in a museum, for example. I remember well when I went in a museum in USA, and then I saw I can't remember now which museum was, but I saw an exhibition about the ages of the humanity, for example, and when people show the primitive world, they use some images of Black people that was really negative to show that. But when they were talking about the Ice Age, for example, they used some white images that was very clean. That the way that they disposed that images was telling an history. Just the way that they put that images was telling an image. The environment that they create, for example, to show a group of people in Africa and a group of people in Europe and at the same moment of the humanity. I really loved that that white people that was showing that environment was so clean, no marks on the face, for example, while Black people was with some marks of dust and dirt in their face. Only the way that they put that images together was telling a history. That was telling a history. We have to think about how to put images in a museum, how to consider it, how to show information about this. For me, it is very important to bring new kind of thinking to the museums, to bring artists that can tell other histories, other narratives to the museum, and I think as well how to show images when you put that inside a museum, because we are telling another, you tell a history not only when you have an idea into that, but the way you display that idea, it is very, very important.
It helps to also create the narrative, that the display is part and parcel of the narrative itself. All right, well, I think we are well beyond our original time, but we've had a really, really rich conversation, and I just want to once again thank Rosana Paulino and Jamaica Kincaid for sharing with us today. And thank you so much, Rachel, for inviting me to be a part of the panel.
And thank you, Cheryl, for bringing together these threads, these histories, and these places together for such a meaningful discussion. And of course, another warm thank you to Rosana and Jamaica for sharing your projects and ideas with us. Again, we hope to see all of you guys back at 1 if you can for the final session of this 4-part program. And if you have not already registered, don't worry, you can click on the link that's been dropped in the chat and register now. But take care. Hope everybody has a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Bye.